Hi everyone. For this lecture, we are pivoting to a new kind of experimental method called a natural experiment. So we're going to understand the features of natural experiments. They're sort of continuing this trend that we saw from the movement between lab and field experiments of kind of increasing or attempting to increase the external validity of our studies. So this move from field to natural experiments is going to continue that trend, but with a similar issue that we might lose some internal validity, we'll lose some control over the way our treatments are administered. And so in talking about that, we're going to try to understand the advantages and more importantly, the disadvantages of conducting a natural experiment. So just recapping where we've been so far this semester in our focus on lab and field experiments, the key limitation that we haven't really addressed explicitly is that there's actually many important research questions that we can't really test with what we would say a true experiment, so with random control, random assignment and so forth, because it's actually not possible to randomly assign people to experimental groups. So far this semester, we've really just been looking at situations where we're studying questions and topics where we can devise a study that random assignment is possible. But there's going to be situations where we might have research questions and hypotheses that we just are unable to create these experimental situations on our own that we would like to study. So I just want to give you some examples. In some cases, it's not going to be feasible. So for example, maybe I want to know what the long-term impact of TikTok is on children, and I would want to randomly assign children to use or not use TikTok for a long period of time, say 10 years. You can pick whatever long period of time you want. Cool study design, but going to be really tricky to do. So one, keeping kids off TikTok for that long of a time for so much of their childhood and teenage years, just really going to be tricky to do, going to be unfeasible to do. Eventually they're going to want to opt out of doing that, even if they have opted in at some point early in the study. You can also imagine it would be difficult with convincing parents and families to do it and to keep following up with you for that long. So there's just some study designs that, while cool in theory, just aren't really going to work out in practice. It might also be actually unethical. So, for example, we can't randomly assign children to receive or enact cyberbullying against each other. So I can't bring a kid into my lab and randomly assign them to be cyberbullied by another kid. I don't think. Maybe there's an ethical review board that would let me do it, but I'm not so sure. I also probably can't encourage a kid to go out and cyberbully somebody else. I can't motivate them and randomly assign them to engaging in behaviors that I think are going to be harmful for themselves or harmful for others. Again, maybe you could figure out a situation where you could devise this kind of study, but in general, when we're studying harm and negative outcomes, it's going to be trickier to randomly assign people in the ways that maybe theoretically we would like, but ethically in practice are going to be not so possible to do, or at least less possible to do. And in some cases, it might be impossible to conduct a experiment the way we would like. So maybe I'm interested in what the impact of the internet is on how people develop over the course of their lifespan. So either Wi-Fi connection or whatever it might be. I can't really think of a situation where I can randomly assign some people to have the internet and some people to not have the internet. I can maybe think of situations where some people do have access and some people don't have access, but I myself, I struggle to think of a situation where I can actually create that situation where some people have access to the internet and they grow up with it, and some people don't have access to the internet and they grow up without it. Those conditions might exist out in the world, but it's not something that I, the researcher, can create on my own. And so that transitions nicely into this idea of a natural experiment. And the idea here is that there's some outside event that's going to create the conditions that resemble an experiment, but the researcher was not actually involved in administering the intervention. So I haven't actually created the treatment and control groups. I've actually just observed or witnessed the kind of existence of these treatment and control groups out in the real world based on something that's happened out in the real world. So I'll show you some examples momentarily, but the key part is that the researcher hasn't created these things. They actually have to kind of identify when these kind of nice situations have occurred that they could actually be doing a study on what's going on out there in the real world. This is sometimes going to be called a quasi-experiment, and so the textbook chapter on experiments that you read earlier this semester is actually going to use this language of quasi-experiment. And the idea there is just that it's like almost an experiment, but that it's missing a really important piece. And that piece is that the researcher has not created the intervention, the researcher has not administered the intervention, and really most importantly, the researcher has not randomly assigned you to receiving an intervention. All of these things have kind of happened out in the world. So the treatment and the controls have naturally emerged and they exist out in the world, and people have self-selected or been kind of forced into those situations on their own. The researcher has not controlled any of that. So what are some of these examples of interventions, natural interventions that might be occurring in the world that have nothing to do with the researcher? So we can think about things like policy changes. So they could be policy changes at various levels of government. So local governments enact a law, state governments enact a law, federal governments enact a law, nations enact a law. And so we can start thinking about comparing, different communities that have and haven't enacted a law, different states that have and have not enacted a law, different nations that have and have not enacted a law. So you can start to think about, okay, some groups have decided to organize their society, their community in this way, and some have decided to organize their society or community in this way. And we can try to start drawing comparisons across those communities based on these different decisions that they've made. On a more kind of micro level, we can think about kind of rule changes within schools. Some schools apply a new rule, some schools don't. Maybe even some schools within the same school system pilot a new rule at one school and they pilot a different rule at another school. And you can start potentially drawing comparisons between those schools. When we even think about just like platforms, so social media platforms, you can think that some platforms might institute changes in how they operate. So, removing a like button or keeping a like button, or displaying how many likes something got or not displaying how many likes something got. There are also interesting moments of like platform outages where, TikTok might just go offline for a few hours and you could sort of test to see what people looked like before, during, and after those outages. Relatedly, things like natural disasters. So if a storm comes through and you lose access to the internet, you lose access to things that you would normally have access to, how does that impact you in the short term relative to when when access is restored to those different, whatever that might be, whatever those resources could be. And this is going to allow us to start asking kind of interesting questions, but more advanced questions than we could necessarily test in a lab or a field experiment. So we can start to think about like what happens when children begin using smartphones, when they're first given access to smartphones versus when they don't have access to smartphones. What happens when a country receives internet access relative to before it had internet access? What happens when TikTok goes down versus when TikTok is live? So we can start thinking about all these real world situations that might be going on. And as a really keen kind of thoughtful researcher, we can start to say, okay, I'm witnessing these naturally occurring circumstances out in the world that sort of share some of the features of an experimental design that I really like. What could I do to try and examine the impact of those naturally occurring interventions as they're unfolding? What would I have to do to collect some data to kind of look at what's going on out there in the real world? Oh, and sorry, I had another example here about schools banning phones. So what happens when a school bans phones versus doesn't? So the key question for the design of a natural experiment is, how do we know we can treat these events that are happening in the world as a natural experiment? How can I convince other people to look at this policy change or look at this outage or look at this natural disaster and say, hey, there's a natural experiment currently unfolding. We need to do something with this. Can we actually treat this as an experiment? And one of the key things that researchers are going to do when they're designing and then running a natural experiment is that they're going to look for evidence of group equivalence. So as I've noted, the researcher is in control of random assignment here. The policy change is just going to happen. The natural disaster is just going to happen. The outage is just going to happen. The platform's just going to change. And some people are going to be exposed to those things and some people are not. The researcher hasn't controlled it. And so when we lack that random assignment, we're always going to have these questions about group equivalence. Were the groups that I'm comparing similar to one another before the treatment actually occurred? And how could I assess that? So I'm going to want to look at the communities that I'm including in my study, and I'm going to want to demonstrate a few things. One, that the treatment that I'm interested in occurred before I've actually tried to measure the outcome. So similar in the context of an experimental design, I want to make sure people have been exposed to the media I'm interested in before I've assessed them on whatever outcome I'm interested in. So I want to know that they've been exposed to the violent content before I assess their aggressive behavior, and not the other way around. And then, as I mentioned, that these groups look somewhat similar before that treatment was administered. So if I'm comparing two communities that have administered a law or didn't administer a law, how can I be certain and can I demonstrate in some way that before that law was instituted, they were pretty similar? So maybe similar socioeconomic status, similar racial demographics, similar age demographics, whatever it could be. I want to try and to demonstrate that despite the lack of random assignment to these different conditions, the groups were pretty similar beforehand. And ideally, a good natural experiment would be able to do that. And then relatedly, that the groups didn't differ before the treatment on the outcome that I'm interested in. So if aggression is something I'm interested in, there wasn't pre-existing differences that one of these communities was already more aggressive than one of the other communities. One of these schools wasn't already more aggressive than one of these other schools, and so forth. So you essentially, because you can't set up the experiment the way that you'd like to try and demonstrate that those features that we appreciate about an experiment are kind of still naturally occurring out there in the world. And because of that, we can then look for the effects of whatever natural intervention we're interested in studying. So I want to show you an example of this that's in your assigned reading about natural experiments this week, just because I think it's a really cool, clever, and interesting example about how we can design a natural experiment to test questions that we've been assessing in the lab and potentially see how they come to different conclusions about what the effects of, in this case, violent media are. So we're kind of pivoting back to the first half of the course, revisiting violent media, before next week, where we're going to look at this in the context of social media and natural experiments on social media. So in this study by Dahl and Della Vigna, the researchers were examining weekend releases of blockbuster films. They were essentially noting, hey, every weekend there's new movies released. Sometimes those movies are really violent, and sometimes those movies are really not so violent. And what we could do, actually, is compare some of these weekends that have highly violent movies with movies that have not so violent movies. So as an example, again, this was an older study, and so they were looking at many weekends across different years leading up to when they were actually conducting this in 2009. So for example, there was a weekend in February 2001 where the very violent movie Hannibal came out. And so you could say, hey, some weekends there's going to be a really big violent movie that comes out, such as Hannibal, and people are going to go see that movie, and what are the implications of seeing it? And we can compare that potentially to other weekends where less violent or non-violent movies were released. So we can look at February 2002, same weekend in February, the same weekend a year later, where a movie was released that's not so violent, Crossroads, a Britney Spears movie. If you haven't seen Crossroads, I highly recommend it. Pretty fun. But we can start to say, hey, we could assume that there's probably a lot of consistencies when we look at the same weekend in February across multiple years. Usually the weather's going to be kind of similar, the socio-political climate's kind of similar, the time of year is kind of similar, you're the same distance from New Year's as you are to Valentine's Day, and so forth. There's a lot of kind of features of looking at these temporal differences that we could say, hey, same weekend of the year on different years are really similar in ways that we think are kind of interesting, but they might differ on these big kind of blockbuster movies that come out. Some are going to have highly violent movies that come out, and some are going to have not so violent movies that come out. And what these researchers said is that, hey, we could actually look at violent crime rates across those weekends and say, do we see a difference in weekends that we think are relatively comparable or relatively similar? Do we see that there's differences in violent crime that occurs when violent movies are released versus when non-violent movies are released? So as the researcher, I'm no longer kind of assigning people to watch these films. I'm saying, hey, out there in the world, people are self-selecting into these films on different weekends of the year. And then we can actually see what are the practical, meaningful, observable effects on those weekends of an outcome that we really care about, in this case, something like violent crime. So importantly, the researchers are not randomly assigning movie attendance in this study. Instead, they're just exploiting this natural variation that they're observing out there in the world. They're exploiting that movies are released on different weekends, and that those movies are going to vary in how violent they are, and that we can make assumptions or make arguments to say that otherwise these weekends are pretty similar in a lot of the other features that they share. Ideally, a good natural experiment is going to do a lot of stuff to kind of confirm that assumption. I'll go ahead and hand wave and say they do that in this study. I'm not going to go into depth about that. It's beyond the scope of this class, but it's important to say the researchers are noting this natural variation, and they're going to say these weekends or this situation is pretty comparable in a lot of ways, except this one that I'm really interested in, the presence or absence of violent media. So revisiting just some of our theorizing from earlier in the semester, if we were thinking about hypotheses for this study, rooted in these kind of original lab experiments that we had looked at, if we have our independent variable of the level of violence in blockbuster movies, we have high violence weekends and low violence weekends. We have our dependent variable, which is going to be the rate of violent crime each weekend. So they're actually looking at crime rate statistics. So they're not going out and observing individual behavior or anything like that. They're just saying, what happened overall on these weekends, and how could we summarize that? And you might think, okay, if we take the theorizing from our original lab experiments earlier this semester, we might say we expect and we predict that those high violence movies weekends are going to have more violent crime than low violence movie weekends. But what the authors actually predicted in this study was kind of interesting. What they were predicting was that high movie violence weekends are actually going to exhibit less violent crime. And so clearly they're not theorizing this issue in quite the same way as researchers have theorized this issue in lab experiments. And so I want to break that down. So in the lab setting, what type of theory seems most relevant? So when we're kind of theorizing these media violence effects in the lab, we're thinking about thoughts of feeling, thoughts of behavior, theory of feelings, theory of thoughts, theories of behavior, like excitation, transfer, priming, and social learning. And so you might predict, hey, people who watch these high violent movies are going to be really anxious and angry and hostile after they've watched these films. They're going to have a lot of maybe hostile thoughts in their minds. They've maybe witnessed a lot of hostile behaviors, and maybe they're going to leave that movie and engage in a lot of these hostile behaviors in their everyday life. But what the researchers are saying in this natural setting, we might expect something slightly different to happen. And they're actually drawing on this theory of behavior that we've discussed in the second half of this class, this notion of displacement. And what they're arguing is this, that once we move from the lab, where we have randomly assigned people to condition, and we move into a natural setting where participants are self-selecting into seeing what movies they want to see on which weekends, we might actually see an effect of displacement. And so what the authors argue is that they expect violent individuals are actually going to self-select into seeing violent movies on weekends when those movies are released, which may temporarily actually displace activities that might otherwise occur. So those people might not be going to parties, they might not be drinking, they might not be going to bars. And because they have sort of displaced these not so good behaviors with seeing a violent movie, we might expect violent crime to actually reduce on those weekends because they're no longer kind of putting themselves into situations where then these violent behaviors might actually occur. So they're sort of twisting these predictions because we've moved from this randomly assigned situation to a situation of self-selection. And so the researchers are trying to say, when we think about the real world way that violent media is produced and consumed and released, we might actually expect to see that it is beneficial for when we look at something like violent crime rates. And so that's what they're going to look at in this study. So this is just a figure from their study. The x-axis here is showing these three different conditions of those who watched non-violent movie weekends, mildly violent movie weekends, and strongly violent movie weekends. I showed you an example of just the violent and non-violent, the Hannibal and Crossroads, but they also had some sort of mildly violent movies in here as well. And the thing I want to just draw your attention to are these bars that we see for the mildly violent and strongly violent movies relative to the non-violent movies. And the y-axis here being the decrease or what the actual crime estimates are at these different points in time. They're showing you actual versus predicted. You don't have to worry so much about that. But the point here being there's two different lines for different periods of time. So it's in the evening, around when people might be watching those movies between 6 p.m. and 12 a.m., And then also after those, the movie might have actually been viewed from 12 to 6 a.m. And so they're arguing that, violent crime is often happening in these nighttime hours, and that we might see the effect of watching these movies kind of trend in different ways over different points in the evening on these weekends. The important point here is that when we look at these trend lines, what we're actually seeing is consistent with what the authors were arguing for displacement, that on those high violent movie weekends, there was actually seeing less violent crime relative to those non-violent movie weekends. And interestingly, the effect was actually more pronounced for the period after the viewing period. So the effect of viewing on the decrease in crime, or I should say the effect of attendance on the decrease in crime, was more pronounced following those movies, following the time period when they would have watched the movies. And the researchers call this what they term voluntary incapacitation, that essentially these individuals who might normally be out on the streets getting into trouble are actually self-selecting into these films and then maybe going home and going to bed afterward, rather than getting into these environments or situations that might otherwise lead to violent crime. So again, the researcher is just taking this kind of interesting, unique approach to say, hey, we can exploit this natural variation in stuff that's happening in the real world and try to measure these real world practical impacts that we might be interested in studying in ways that would be impossible to do in a lab environment. To recap what we're sort of seeing here in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of these studies, for a natural experiment, in this particular case, we're looking at real consumers, real movie releases, real crime rates, all just completely real world settings. So we have some really compelling external validity for this kind of study. But we really have a lot of disadvantages when it comes to internal validity. We'd like to say, hey, these weekends differed on nothing else except the movie that was released, but you can imagine there's a lot of other things that might differ across these weekends. And if we look at enough of these weekends over time, we can start maybe building an argument. But ideally, we would want the researchers to kind of be trying to demonstrate that there really was comparability between these weekends where violent movies were released, or there was equivalence across these different weekends. And if they're able to show that, you might be more convinced that, hey, maybe movie attendance has something to do with it. But if they're not able to demonstrate that, you might be less convinced. And then either way, no matter what the researchers are doing, no matter how many alternative explanations they're attempting to rule out, there's going to be other ones you can probably think of when we're dealing with something as big and amorphous as like this weekend versus that weekend. Was there a sports team that won something on this weekend and not that weekend? Was there some big historical event that happened on that weekend and not that other weekend? So when we move out into these natural settings and the researcher actually isn't in control of how the intervention is administered, we're going to be able to come up with lots and lots and lots of alternative explanations, like seasonal factors or history or what have you. And we would wonder what other events could be explaining this variation that we see in crime rates that really have nothing to do with movies, or maybe are associated with movie release but have nothing to do with the film itself. So a lot of more questions that they're going to be raised, but natural experiments are a really cool tool that we can have in our researcher toolkit to pair with these lab experiments and field experiments and see if we come to similar or different conclusions when we use these different kinds of methods. So anytime you're reading a natural experiment, as we will be doing next week, the questions you want to be thinking about are who created the treatment, how did it sort of emerge out there in the world, and who noticed it and decided to actually study it. Within that real world situation, who received the treatment and who did not? And importantly, how comparable are those groups before they received the treatment? Are we really comparing apples to apples, or are we comparing apples to oranges? Are these groups, pretty similar in how they're pre-existing in the world, or were they really different in a lot of important ways that the researcher should be trying to account for in the study? And given whether you're convinced or not convinced on that comparability, after you've seen the results, what alternative explanations remain? Besides the fact that this naturally occurring thing was out there and we were able to study it, what else could have contributed to group differences between the groups that they're studying? So I want you to be thinking about those questions for this paper you're going to read for next week, which is about phone bans in schools. And so it's an example of what's happening pretty commonly now of schools instituting policies on phone bans and how social media can be used in schools. And the researchers are kind of exploiting natural variation in the presence of these policies and looking at change in student well-being and academic outcomes over time. So as you're reading this study, I want you to be thinking about what makes this a natural experiment as opposed to a lab experiment or a field experiment. And similar to last week, I want you to be thinking about what surprises you about these results. Because as I've mentioned, a lot of these social media studies that we're going to be reading are maybe going to surprise you in terms of what they're finding when we try to study these things out in the real world. All right, and so this lecture, whoops, sorry about that. All right, so this lecture intended to introduce you to the features of natural experiments and understand the advantages and disadvantages of natural experiments. We looked at some media violence examples here, but we will pivot right back to social media next week. So I'm excited to get your thoughts about what you think about some of this research that's using natural experiments to study social media effects.